"Ma'am, this section is reserved. You'll have to move." The voice was young, crisp, and saturated with an unearned authority that grated on the quiet morning air. Captain Evan Davies of the Judge Advocate General's Corps stood over the small, elderly woman, his immaculate white uniform a stark contrast to her simple gray cardigan and lavender dress. He gestured vaguely at the empty rows of chairs surrounding her, chairs awaiting the arrival of decorated officers and esteemed dignitaries for the Naval Academy's commissioning ceremony. Her presence, to him, was a stain on the perfect tapestry of military precision. She looked up, her face a roadmap of 80-some years, her eyes a pale, steady blue that seemed to absorb his impatience without reflecting it. "My grandson is graduating today," she said, her voice soft but not frail. "David Vance. He told me to sit here." Davies allowed a small, condescending smile to touch his lips. "I'm sure he did, ma'am. But these seats are specifically assigned. Perhaps your invitation has a different section number? We have general admission seating further back." He spoke slowly, as if to a child who had wandered away from her parents. He saw not a person, but a problem to be managed, a deviation from the day's rigid schedule. The woman, Alara, simply shook her head. "No," he said here. Her certainty was quiet, a simple statement of fact that irritated him further. It was a disruption. Her faded dress, her worn but clean shoes, her hands knotted with arthritis resting in her lap. They didn't belong in the front row, beside the gleaming brass and polished leather of the Navy's elite. "With all due respect," Davies said, the phrase a hollow courtesy, "I cannot allow you to remain. It's a matter of protocol." He glanced over his shoulder, catching the eye of a burly petty officer from the security detail. He gave a subtle nod. The security officer, Riggs, began to move toward them, his expression one of bored duty. This was a simple task: remove the confused old woman before the admirals arrived. Alara watched him approach, her posture unchanging. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger. There was only a profound stillness, a deep and ancient patience that seemed to emanate from her very bones. She had faced down far worse things than a boy in a starched uniform. Petty Officer Riggs arrived, his presence a wall of youthful muscle and military procedure. He was younger than Davies, but carried himself with the blunt confidence of someone whose authority was physical. "Problem, Captain?" he asked, his gaze flicking dismissively over Alara. "This lady seems to be confused about her seating assignment," Davies explained, his tone shifting to one of shared superiority. "She needs to be escorted to the general admission area." Riggs nodded, a curt, professional gesture. He turned his full attention to Alara. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." Now his voice was flat, a command that expected immediate compliance. Alara didn't move. She looked past both men, her gaze fixed on the vast green expanse of the parade ground where neat rows of midshipmen, her grandson among them, stood like white statues under the morning sun. The scent of cut grass and sea salt filled the air, a smell that dredged up memories from a lifetime ago, memories of damp earth and the metallic tang of fear. "My grandson," she repeated, her voice a near whisper, "is out there. I will not miss this." The simple, maternal declaration was an act of defiance that neither man was equipped to understand. To them, it was the stubbornness of senility. "You won't miss it," Riggs said, his patience wearing thin. "You'll just be watching from a different location. Let's go." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. The crowd of arriving families was beginning to notice the quiet confrontation. Whispers rippled through the stands. A few people pulled out their phones, sensing a minor drama about to unfold. The spectacle amplified Davies's urgency. This needed to end quickly and quietly. "Ma'am, if you do not cooperate, I will be forced to remove you," Riggs stated, his hand moving toward her arm. Alara finally turned her gaze from the parade ground and looked directly at him. For a fleeting moment, the pale blue of her eyes seemed to harden into something akin to chipped ice. The change was so subtle, so swift, that Riggs barely registered it. He saw only an obstinate old woman. He did not see the shadow of a commander assessing a threat. "Do not touch me," she said. The words were not loud, but they carried a weight that made Riggs hesitate. From his post near the edge of the VIP section, Marine Sergeant Marcus Cole watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. He was part of the Admiral's security detail, a young man with old eyes who had seen 2 tours in places that were nothing like this manicured Annapolis lawn. His job was to be invisible, to observe, to identify anomalies. And the old woman was an anomaly, but not in the way Captain Davies thought. Cole had been trained to read people, to see beyond the surface. He saw her worn clothes and wrinkled skin, but he also saw the way she sat. Her back was ramrod straight, a posture that discipline, not a corset, had ingrained over decades. Her hands, though gnarled with age, were not clasped in a frail, elderly manner. They rested on her knees with a purposeful stillness, fingers slightly curled, as if ready to act. It was a posture of readiness he'd seen in grizzled gunnery sergeants and seasoned recon Marines. He watched Davies' preen and Riggs' posture, and he felt a familiar irritation. They saw a civilian, a nuisance. They were blind to the details. They didn't see the unnerving calm in her eyes, the complete absence of panic as 2 uniformed men tried to intimidate her. They didn't notice the subtle, economic shift of her weight as Riggs approached, a preparatory movement so ingrained it was likely unconscious. Cole's instincts, honed in the dusty streets of Fallujah, were screaming that something was wrong. This wasn't a confused grandmother. This was something else entirely. He began to move slowly, a casual stroll that brought him closer to the confrontation, his eyes never leaving the trio. He needed a better angle, a clearer view. He saw Riggs reach for the woman's arm, saw her quiet, authoritative command to stop. He saw the momentary flicker of hesitation in the petty officer's eyes. These young men thought their uniforms gave them power. They had no concept of true authority, the kind that needed no rank or insignia to be felt, the kind that was earned in darkness and silence, far from any parade ground. He was now close enough to hear her voice clearly, to see the fine lines around her eyes. And as he watched, he realized what was truly bothering him. It wasn't just her posture. It was her presence. She felt anchored, rooted to that spot by a force more powerful than sentiment. Ignoring Alara's quiet warning, Riggs decided the situation required a firm hand. The whispers from the crowd were growing louder, and the first of the high-ranking officials were beginning to file into the reserved section. He had his orders. With a sigh of theatrical frustration, he reached out and took hold of her upper arm. "Ma'am, we're done talking," he said, his voice low and firm as he began to pull her to her feet. The moment his fingers closed around her arm, 2 things happened. The first was a flicker in Alara's eyes, a brief, violent storm that passed as quickly as it came. The touch was a trigger, a sensory key that unlocked a door deep within her memory. For an instant, she was not on a sunny parade ground in Annapolis. She was in a freezing, muddy trench somewhere in the Ardennes, the cold seeping into her bones. The grip on her arm was not a young sailor's, but the desperate clutch of a wounded soldier. She was pulling from a burning half-track, the smell of diesel and scorched earth filling her lungs, the roar of artillery fire a constant thunder in her ears. The memory was a ghost, there and gone in the space of a heartbeat, but it left an icy residue in its wake. The second event was far more tangible. As Riggs pulled her upward, the loose sleeve of her gray cardigan slid down a few inches, exposing the fragile, paper-thin skin of her forearm. And there, revealed for the first time in the bright morning light, was a tattoo. It was ancient, the ink faded from a stark black to a hazy, bluish-gray, its lines blurred by the passage of 70 years. It was not a crude anchor or a pin-up girl. It was a complex, stylized design, a coiled serpent with a single, unsheathed dagger piercing its center, all of it encircled by a wreath of what looked like nightshade. It was a symbol of nothing recognizable, a relic from a forgotten creed. Riggs didn't even notice it. Davies gave it a passing glance of distaste. But Sergeant Cole, standing less than 10 feet away, froze. His blood ran cold. He had seen that symbol before, not in person, but in a single, heavily redacted photograph within a classified historical briefing at Quantico. It was the insignia of a unit that, according to official records, never existed. A unit so secret its members were ghosts, their files burned, their names erased from history. Cole's mind raced, connecting the impossible dots. The posture, the stillness, the eyes, and now, the tattoo. It couldn't be. The unit had been disbanded at the end of World War II. Its members were all presumed dead, lost to time and secrecy. He broke protocol without a second thought. Turning sharply, he strode past the gawking onlookers, his mind a whirlwind of history and disbelief. He approached a stern-faced Navy commander who was overseeing the VIP arrivals. "Commander, pardon me, Sergeant Cole," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There is a situation you need to be aware of." Immediately, the commander, annoyed at the breach of etiquette, began to dismiss him, but the raw intensity in Cole's eyes stopped him. "What is it, Sergeant?" "The woman," Cole said, nodding back toward Alara, who was now being forcibly led toward the aisle. "The one being removed. Check her right forearm. There's a tattoo. A serpent and a dagger." The commander frowned, the description meaning nothing to him. "And what is your point, sir?" Cole pressed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That's the unit crest for OSS Blackbriar." The commander's face went slack. The color drained from his cheeks. Office of Strategic Services Blackbriar. It was a phantom, a legend whispered about in the highest echelons of intelligence and special operations history. They were the deniable assets of the war, the ones sent on missions from which no one was expected to return. The information shot up the chain of command like a lit fuse. The commander spoke urgently into his radio, his words clipped and coded. The message reached an aide standing near the main reviewing stand, who then leaned over and whispered into the ear of the man presiding over the entire ceremony. Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, the Chief of Naval Operations. On the stand, Admiral Thorne was the picture of military composure. His face was a granite mask of duty. But as his aide relayed the sergeant's message, the mask cracked. The Admiral's eyes, which had been scanning the pristine formation of midshipmen, widened in stunned disbelief. He looked toward the commotion at the edge of the stands, his gaze finding the small, gray-haired woman being manhandled by a petty officer. He saw her sleeve, still slightly pushed up. His breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. And yet, there it was. In a move that stunned the entire academy, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, a man known for his unyielding adherence to tradition and ceremony, did the unthinkable. He stood up, interrupting the commandant's opening remarks mid-sentence. He descended the steps of the reviewing stand, his movements stiff with a mixture of fury and awe. The parade ground fell into a hushed, confused silence. Thousands of eyes followed the five-star admiral as he strode across the pristine lawn, his expression grim, his path unwavering. He was not heading for the podium. He was heading directly for the source of the disturbance. Captain Davies and Petty Officer Riggs saw him coming. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized them both. They thought he was furious about the public scene they had created, about their failure to handle a simple matter discreetly. They braced for a career-ending reprimand. Davies's face paled, his carefully constructed world of regulations and protocol crumbling around him. Riggs instinctively let go of Alara's arm, his hand falling to his side as if burned. He snapped to attention, his eyes locked forward, sweat beading on his brow. The Admiral didn't even look at them. He walked past them as if they were statues, his entire focus on the small, unassuming woman they had been trying to eject. He stopped a respectful 2 feet in front of her, his towering frame casting a long shadow. He stood there for a long moment, simply looking at her, his hard, sea-weathered face a complex tapestry of emotions, disbelief, reverence, and a profound, bone-deep respect. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Her grandson, David, standing in the front rank of the graduating class, watched in utter confusion as the highest-ranking officer in the Navy approached his grandmother. He felt a surge of protective anger, assuming she was in some kind of trouble. The Admiral slowly raised his hand, not in anger, but in a gesture of quiet request. "Ma'am," he said. His voice, which had commanded carrier strike groups and echoed in the halls of the Pentagon, was now soft, almost trembling. "May I see your arm?" Alara, her composure unruffled by the sudden, dramatic turn of events, simply held out her right arm. The gray cardigan sleeve fell away completely, revealing the faded tattoo in its entirety. The serpent, the dagger, the wreath of nightshade. It was a ghost made flesh. Admiral Thorne stared at it, his eyes tracing the blurred lines as if reading a sacred text. He had spent his life studying naval history, the great battles, the legendary commanders. But this symbol represented a history that was never written down, a history of shadows and sacrifice that made the Grand Fleet actions seem almost simple by comparison. He looked up from the tattoo to her face, his eyes searching hers, seeking confirmation of the impossible. OSS Blackbriar. He breathed the words, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, a name spoken with the reverence one might reserve for a prayer. The name hung in the silent air, meaningless to most, but a thunderclap to the few who knew. They were officially designated Tactical Espionage Unit 7. Thorne continued, his voice growing stronger, taking on a formal, pedagogical tone as he began to address not just Alara, but the entire silent assembly. He turned slightly, ensuring his voice would carry across the parade ground. They operated behind enemy lines from 1942 to 1945. Their missions were classified at the highest possible level. They sabotaged enemy infrastructure, organized resistance networks, and eliminated high-value targets. They were ghosts, phantoms. Their operational charter contained a single, chilling sentence. No rescue, no recovery, no recognition. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Every member was a volunteer, recruited from the most elite units of the Allied forces. Their files were expunged upon entry. To the world, they simply ceased to exist. They were considered expendable. Their casualty rate was 90%. His gaze swept over the stunned faces of Davies and Riggs, and there was a cold fire in his eyes. He was no longer just an admiral. He was a custodian of history, a guardian of a sacred, forgotten honor. Thorne turned his attention back to Alara, his expression softening once more. The unit had a commander, he said, his voice now carrying across the silent field, amplified by the perfect acoustics of the hushed morning. An operative whose strategic brilliance was matched only by their lethality. They planned and led the most dangerous missions themselves. They were wounded 3 times, but refused evacuation. They single-handedly dismantled the Gestapo network in Lyon. They were known only by their call sign. He took a deep, steadying breath. They called her the Wraith. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Her, the Wraith, was a woman. The legend had always been assumed to be a man, a nameless, faceless soldier of impossible skill. David Vance felt the world tilt on its axis. His grandmother? His quiet, gentle grandmother who made gingerbread cookies and told him stories about growing up on a farm? It was impossible. It made no sense. Admiral Thorne looked directly at Alara, his eyes filled with a certainty that defied all logic. He had spent years of his personal time petitioning for the declassification of Blackbriar's records, trying to piece together the fragments of their story to find any of the lost names. He had studied the few surviving, grainy photographs. He had read the fragmented, heavily redacted after-action reports. He knew the legend of the Wraith better than anyone. For 70 years, the Admiral declared, his voice ringing with righteous fury and profound respect, this nation has failed to recognize its greatest heroes. We put their names on no walls. We award them no medals. We let their stories fade into myth because their sacrifice was too quiet, too absolute for us to comprehend. He then did something no one present had ever seen. Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, a man who had met with presidents and kings, a warrior who had stood on the bridges of warships in hostile waters, snapped his body to the rigid, perfect posture of attention. He raised his right hand to his brow, palm down, fingers straight, and rendered a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture exchanged between officers. It was an act of profound, soul-deep reverence. An apology, a recognition, a thank you 70 years overdue from a grateful nation embodied in a single man. To Alara Vance. To the Wraith. The sharp, crisp sound of the Admiral's hand striking his brow echoed in the stunned silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if a spell had been broken, a ripple of motion began. On the parade ground, a single senior midshipman, the brigade commander, processed what he had just witnessed. His training, his instincts, his very soul screamed at him to act. He bellowed a single, powerful command. Brigade, attention. Present, ARMS. In perfect, unified motion, more than 1,000 midshipmen snapped to attention, their rifles moving in a single, fluid gesture of salute. They were followed instantly by every uniformed officer in the stands, from the youngest ensigns to the most grizzled captains. Sergeant Cole, his face a mask of fierce pride, executed the sharpest salute of his life. The air filled with the thunderous sound of thousands of hands slapping against rifle stocks and saluting brows. It was a wave of respect so powerful, so absolute, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the academy. David Vance stood in the front rank, his body moving on instinct, his mind reeling. He looked at his grandmother, this small, quiet woman he had known his entire life, and saw her for the first time. He saw the steel beneath the soft wrinkles, the fire behind the gentle eyes. He remembered all the times she'd taught him to be quiet, to observe, to think before acting. He remembered her uncanny ability to know when he was lying, her strange insistence on him learning to navigate by the stars. It all clicked into place, a lifetime of puzzle pieces forming a picture so incredible it was almost impossible to believe. He was saluting not just his grandmother, but a living legend, a hero forged in the secret fires of a world at war. Captain Davies and Petty Officer Riggs remained frozen, forgotten. The thunderous salute was their judgment. They had mistaken a monument for a pebble. They had tried to dismiss history itself. Their faces were ashen, their arrogance stripped away, leaving only the raw, sickening shame of their ignorance. The world had turned upside down. The powerful were humbled, and the humble was revealed to be the most powerful of all. Alara stood in the eye of the storm, the wave of salutes washing over her. She did not weep. She did not smile. She simply inclined her head, a small, graceful nod of acknowledgement. It was a gesture of a commander accepting the respect of her troops. She had not sought this. She had never wanted it. Her war was a private thing, a collection of ghosts she had carried in silence for more than 7 decades. She had come here today only to see her grandson, to witness the continuation of a legacy of service in a world blessedly at peace. The Admiral held his salute for a long, respectful moment before slowly lowering his hand. He gestured toward the now empty seat of honor beside his own on the reviewing stand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It would be the greatest honor of my career if you would join me." He offered his arm, not as an escort for a frail woman, but as a junior officer would to a revered superior. Alara looked at him, then at the 2 young men who had tried to remove her. Davies and Riggs couldn't meet her gaze. They stared at the ground, their shame a palpable force. She walked toward them, her steps slow but steady. She stopped in front of Captain Davies. He flinched, expecting a tirade, a demand for punishment. Instead, she reached out one of her gnarled hands and gently touched the pristine white fabric of his uniform sleeve. "This," she said, her voice soft but clear, "is what matters. The uniform, the promise it represents. It deserves respect. Always." She then looked him directly in the eye. "But respect for the person who wears it? That must be earned, young man. Never forget that it was not a reprimand. It was a lesson, a final piece of wisdom from a lifetime of command." She offered no anger, no vengeance, only a quiet, powerful grace that was more humbling than any punishment could ever be. She then took the Admiral's offered arm and allowed him to escort her to the front row, to the seat that had been hers by right all along. The ceremony resumed, but its entire context had changed. It was no longer just about the future of the Navy. It was about honoring its forgotten past. When Ensign David Vance was called to the stage to receive his commission, he walked not to the commandant, but first to his grandmother. In front of the entire assembly, he knelt before her, and she pinned his first gold bars onto his collar. The applause was deafening. Later, Captain Davies and Petty Officer Riggs were not discharged. They were reassigned. Their new duty station was at the National Archives, in the Declassification and Historical Records Department. They were tasked by Admiral Thorne himself with a new mission, to find the other ghosts, to sift through the dust and shadows of history and restore the names and stories of the forgotten heroes of Blackbriar and other units like it. It was a penance and a privilege, a long, quiet education in the true meaning of honor, service, and the quiet dignity of those who served in silence.